Good afternoon, Kolkata, and welcome to Times Litfest Kolkata. We are talking about the Mughal Empire in Kolkata, and which has a very strong British legacy. So hopefully we will be able to keep you engaged in the subject. I can understand that once you have a celebrity, it becomes difficult to focus on anything else that happens on stage. But hopefully we'll be able to attract some of your attention. And we have a lovely couple here. And they are authors of a very famous series called Empire of the Mughal. 6 books on the 6 emperors, the great Mughals, so-called great Mughals. And I have written a book on Akbar, which is a non-fiction. It's a history of the emperor and a look at Akbar Badshah through a modern lens and address the politics around Akbar and the Mughals. But today we'll talk more about the successful series Empire of the Mughal. And I would like to ask Diana and Michael as to the kind of efforts that they had to put in while bringing out the series. What sort of visits did you make? What kind of research did you do? If you could just tell us.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this festival. We are so delighted to be here in Kolkata. Our Empire of the Mughal series really grew out of a piece of non-fiction work we did. Many years ago, when we were still young, we came to India for the first time. Like everybody, we saw the Taj Mahal. 20 years later, when we weren't, by that time, full-time writers, we wrote a non-fiction book about the Taj Mahal. And to understand the influences that had led the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan to create it, we started to read back about the history of the Mughals, to try and understand all the influences that had shaped them and enabled them to create something like the Taj. And as we tracked back, reading the chronicles, all the sources we could find, it turned into a huge journey. And it took us beyond the boundaries of India back to Central Asia, where the Mughals first came from. We traveled across Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. We went to Iran. We wanted to see the Persian influences that had shaped the Mughal court and led to structures like the Taj. And then, of course, in India itself, we traveled wherever we could find that had associations with our story. And it was a great pleasure to us to do that because we both love travel, and that's often been part of our motivation for the subjects we choose to write about. But you're asking about this sort of as a big project. We never realized at the beginning how big it was going to be. When we decided that we would write about the Mughal emperors, we thought, well, maybe we could do a trilogy. Often these series get published as trilogies. It seemed a good idea. But the more we read and the deeper we got into the stories, we just realized that was never going to work, that each of the first 6 emperors merited at least a book. And so it turned into a great big project that we never envisaged, that absorbed, I think, more than a decade of our lives. Mike, if you have anything to...
It did absorb more than a decade of our lives. Exactly right. But yeah, we worked on it. They are novels. One thing I should emphasize, although we do put a historical annex at the back. So we worked through chronicles, tried to work out what we could about character, about motivation, and I'm sure we didn't always get it right, but at least I think it makes them hopefully readable.
It's much more than that. It's much more than successful. Now it's going to be on television as well, we hear. If you could just tell us more about that.
Yeah, we were very delighted. We met the producer yesterday from Hotstar, now part of Disney, and they are going to produce a series on each of the Mughal emperors. I think 8 episodes is the current thinking, and filming is starting...
6 seasons, 8 episodes.
Yeah, 6 seasons, 8 episodes. Filming starting in the new year. They will be making some big announcements about it in January, so we've probably said as much as we're allowed to say, except that the showrunner will be a gentleman who I know is very well regarded, called Nikhil Advani. this will be his project. And we are tremendously excited to see characters that, came out of our heads in some cases, actually brought to the screen by people we think, from what we've already seen, will do it brilliantly. And I think there's going to be a lot of talent involved in this project, and we are very, very excited to actually see how it looks. And I think the first series, if everything goes to plan, should be airing in about a year's time.
Yeah, announce the stars in January, which they haven't told us, so we can't tell you. Shoot over 4 months in various places, including Central Asia. Edit then late spring, summer. Premiere in November, December. And that's all we know, and that's all he would tell us.
I actually wanted to ask you if you have any actor, Bollywood actor in mind to play, let's say, Babur. Who do you think should play Babur?
I don't know. We've seen a little shot of the chap who's going to play him. Fortunately, I'm not sufficiently well up on Bollywood actors to know who it is. But he looked jolly good.
He was excellent. Say no more than that.
Okay, because you have studied, in fact, your first book was on Babur, Raiders of the North, and I read that with a lot of delight. In fact, it was quite a surprise, actually, that you had a fiction so well written and so well worded, and with a lot of research. I mean, there are no distortions that I could figure out in that book. So you definitely read the Baburnaama, you referred to it.
We did.
What sort of a man do you think Babur was? I mean, for those readers who have not read your book, what sort of a man do you think Babur was? What sort of a prince, what sort of a king was he?
Yes, if you read the Baburnaama, which is the first autobiography in Islamic literature, I mean, it's a tremendous read, and I think very revealing of the man who wrote it. You get a sense very early on of an individual tremendously ambitious, but also a tremendous sense of entitlement, very conscious of his descent. He bangs on a lot about his ancestry in the opening pages of the Baburnaama, but particularly what you take from that is his descent on his grandmother's side from Genghis Khan, but also his descent through his father's side, something he was much more proud of, from Timur, or Tamburlaine, as we sometimes call him. And Timur was Babur's great model. And of course, Timur had established this fabulous empire based on fabled Samarkand with the gold-bearing river flowing past. Timur had patronized the arts and laid out gardens. And Timur, of course, had come over the Indus. He had gone all the way to Delhi, sacked it so comprehensively that it was said that not a bird sang for 6 months, and carted off the very best craftsmen and skilled people he could find to embellish his capital of Samarkand. So that was the model for Babur in his early years. And he was very patient when we look at his personality, very persistent. You know, here is a warrior prince who captured Samarkand 3 times, lost it 3 times, didn't give up. You know, most people, you think, well, maybe that's enough of that. But he then learned that the kingdom of Kabul, which had belonged to an uncle, had fallen vacant. So he crossed the Hindu Kush, occupied that, then began to hear of trouble over the Indus River, disputes between the rulers of northern Hindustan, and thought that, I talked about entitlement earlier, that it was his right by descent from Timur to cross the Indus and have a go to see what he could capture there. Mike, if you want
would you like to add to that?
I'd just add that neither he nor Timur were anything other than riders and raiders. Timur ravaged Turkey, ravaged Iran, Persia. These were horsemen who thought they were entitled to have a go at anything and everybody.
Yes, and anything that was vulnerable. I mean, in our travels across Central Asia, we saw so many places, and we said to the guides, this must have been a wonderful fortress or city or whatever. And they said, yes, it would have been until Timur's troops arrived, and this is what is left.
You know, it's fascinating because the Mughals themselves resisted the use of the term Mughal for them. They thought it was pretty offensive because Mughal was the Persian for Mongol, and they traced their lineage more from Taimur than the Mongols. You are outsiders to India, and Babur was also an outsider that way.
Yep.
He's often projected as an invader.
Yep.
What sort of cultural shocks did Babur experience when he came to India?
The melons and this, yeah.
Well, you'd think, wouldn't you, that after all the effort of all those campaigns and eventually finally managing to float his troops on rafts down the Kabul River to win his battles and occupy northern India, that he would, when he settled down to see what he had done, that he would have been quite pleased. But if you read the Baburnama, there's a wonderful passage which, if you could distill it down, really says, well, at first I wondered why I bothered, because the fruit isn't as good as what I'm used to. I can't get melons like I used to be able to have in Afghanistan. And he said, the buildings here lack, in my eyes, symmetry, true beauty. But then he sort of cheered himself up a bit. And he said, well, the good thing is, of course, there's a great deal of money here.
A great deal of wealth. And I think the other thing we should just perhaps say is that the reason he found it able to cross all these rivers and to take Delhi was that he had gunpowder, which the Lodi sultans and the other sultans who were defending the area didn't have. He'd got Turkish gunners, cannon gunners.
Yes, that by this time the sultans of Turkey had quite modern artillery, and as Mike says, it was getting hold of weaponry like that, and he was able to load these cannon and things on his rafts and bring them downriver. It was that really made the difference when it came to confrontations on the battlefield. He had the technology.
Yeah, and he was a very good student of war because the Turks were very successful with gunpowder artillery. They demolished the Safavids at Chaldoran in 1514. Exactly. So Babur learned from their example. But apart from Babur, which I'm sure should be a favorite of yours, which other Mughal emperor do you think is lovable or likable to you?
Well, we might well say your subject, Akbar, who in many ways was more inclusive than certainly the people in Europe were at the time. When people in Europe of one branch of the Christian religion were busy burning other branches of the people from other branches of the Christian religion, he was doing his best to unify by marrying Rajput princesses, by abandoning certain taxes which discriminated against people who were not believers, and by having a reasonable system of administration. That's not to say that when he set out he wasn't a conqueror, and a fairly brutal conqueror at that, but I think for his time he had some admirable qualities in terms of tolerance, of diversity and things. But you'll know much better than that.
No, of course not.
No, you will. So what do you think?
I'm supposed to ask you the questions. No, certainly he was a very remarkably open-minded man, and in fact his contemporary was Queen Elizabeth I. And well, of course there were many great things about Queen Elizabeth I as well, but when it comes to religious tolerance, we do see that at the time when she was persecuting the Catholics, Akbar was experimenting with Sulh-e-Kul, universal tolerance and peaceful coexistence and all those things. But again, moving on from Akbar, what about Shah Jahan? I mean, he's always portrayed as the romantic emperor, who of course left his lasting legacy in the form of the Taj Mahal and the subject of your first book, I think.
Yes. Yeah. It's very easy to get seduced by Shah Jahan, this great love for Mumtaz. I'm sorry, did I? I'm so sorry, please. All I was going to say before I yield to higher authority here is that you have this very romantic picture of Shah Jahan, the great love, creator of so much beauty himself, such an accomplished man, so expert in so many aesthetic areas. But you take a look at what happened at the very start of his reign, or what he did to actually clear the way for him to take the throne, and it's a bit like a lion moving in to a new stretch of territory in the wilderness, destroying any sort of rival cubs. That he knocked out nephews, cousins, ruthless against brothers. He was determined that he was going to take the throne, enacting the code of throne or coffin that the Mughals had brought with them from Central Asia. And we tend to forget about that a bit when we think about him settling down in the beautiful Agra fort, remodeling the apartments, all that white marble, flowing with scented rose water, and with Mumtaz by his side. So a very ruthless streak that goes right back to the early stages of Babur in Shah Jahan.
But also a tragic figure in a Shakespearean sense, in seeing 2, 3, I think, of his brothers killed by another full brother as well. They were all full brothers, and himself being imprisoned in that little white marble chatri on the top of the Agra fort, sighing for where he could see Mumtaz's burial place.
Yeah.
That gives him that sign of Shakespearean tragedy, despite some of the other things.
Yes, it is King Lear, and that he couldn't see this problem with his children coming. And the remarkable thing about, the 7 surviving children of Shah Jahan was that they were all full brothers and sisters, whereas previously in the Mughal dynasty, you'd mostly been dealing with half-brothers and half-sisters and tension between them or
Their mothers
less closely related members of the family, but there should have been strong bonds between these siblings, and that's what I think Shah Jahan believed in to an extent, till all of a sudden, when he grew ill, chaos just broke out around him, and it's like Jacobean revenge tragedy, that old cycle reasserted itself, and it's a tragic, poignant story.
Indeed, and of course, what happens when he falls ill? You have the War of Succession, which was indeed bloody and ends with the deaths of many of the sons of Shah Jahan. One of them survives, and that's the subject of my next question. Because whenever we talk about the Mughals, when I was studying history, there was always this binary that Akbar the good Muslim and Aurangzeb the bad Muslim, or the good Mughal, the bad Mughal. So what sense do you make out of that? I mean, your 6th book was on Aurangzeb.
We weren't originally going to write about Aurangzeb, and because we weren't sure what to make of him. He was a very strict Muslim, and he believed in being a very strict Muslim. He undid a lot of the good works that Akbar had done. He reimposed taxes on people who were not believers in his faith. He obviously destroyed many buildings. We were in some temples just outside Gwalior 2 or 3 days ago, and you could see he had knocked the faces off certain of the statues. He did many things like that, and we know that, and so I would have thought that you could say that even if he believed as he himself did, he did many things that we would consider wrong. Beyond that, he, I believe, was partly paranoid. He didn't only inflict damage on his state, he inflicted damage on his family. I don't think there were any of his children that he didn't, for one time or other, put in prison. Diana's, I know, has got some views on why he might have been like that. I just think he was paranoid, but Diana can perhaps tell you what she thinks.
I think when you look at him, you see because it's always light and shade with these things. When we use the words good and bad very easily, but it's always very nuanced. And one of the documents we came across in relation to Aurangzeb was a letter in which he wrote that I don't think my father ever loved me. And I think that gives quite a key to his character, this insecurity, might use the word paranoid, but insecure, jealous, uncertain of his place, unable to build relationships, unable to trust other people, close members of his family or others around him, because he knew of all the conflicts and feelings and ambitions and aspects of his own personality, and he translated those, I think, to those people around him. I think there's a strong degree of hypocrisy in Aurangzeb. He was able to, the terrible things that he did to members of his own family, he found ways of justifying those things. He would always have been able to have come up with some sort of explanation, but by the end of his life, I think we're looking at a sad, tragic, very unhappy figure who's lost touch with nearly everybody in his family, with the one exception, I think the one person who was really almost continually, though not all the time, but close to him, was his sister Jahanara. And I think that she was the one person who could perhaps influence him. But I mean, he wrote things which I think reveal something of his paranoid state of mind. He says remarks like, the art of reigning is so delicate that a king must be jealous even of his own shadow. And he also said, a bit like in Machiavelli's The Prince, that if your kingdom was under threat, and he, of course, would be the person who would define what under threat meant, and he could actually be referring to people within his kingdom, not external invaders. He said, in situations of great danger, as you perceive it, anything is permissible. His words, those, anything is permissible.
I think the great difference between late Akbar and late Aurangzeb is that Akbar could tolerate difference, whereas Aurangzeb had no view other than what he said was right.
Yes, I mean, I think Akbar didn't feel that sense of insecurity, didn't feel that sense of threat. Though, of course, it has to be said, again, his relations with his children were not close. You know, he had his problems with his sons because his attention was diverted elsewhere.
Right. I mean, the later years that you talk about, I remember an incident from Akbar's time. It was an English traveler called Thomas Coriat.
Yes.
Yes, you know, that incident you are aware of course. So Thomas Coriat climbs on top of a mosque and abuses Islam and abuses the Prophet and still manages to come down safe and sound and nothing happens to him. And he's amazed by that. He says, how is it possible that I abuse their gods? And still nothing happened to me. So it was possible in Akbar's empire, but maybe not possible in Aurangzeb's empire, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think there's been a huge shift. I think yes.
Right.
Absolutely right.
You talked about the relationship between Aurangzeb and Jahanara. So I just wanted to expand on it a bit further and ask you about these veiled characters in the Mughal story, the women, the Mughal women. What do you think about their role? I mean, you have traced the history of the story of Ehsan Daulat Begum, Qutlug Nigar Khanum, Babur's mother as well as grandmother. And there have been so many other women, Mughal women, who played an important role in not just the society but also the polity. So if you could just tell us about that.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things which struck us, I think, from the beginning, is what strong women there were in the Mughal story. As you say, quite rightly, you look at the Baburnama, and you see that Babur probably would never have been able to become ruler of his own little kingdom of Fergana when his father suddenly tumbled into a ravine, when his dove just collapsed one day. Imagine this little sandstone fortress, just half of it falling away, tumbling down a cliff. If Babur had not had the support of very strong-minded grandmother in particular, but also mother, and that thread persists through the story. Humayun, who had many problems, had a sister on whom he could rely. She is the source for a lot of Humayun's story. When we get to the time of Jahangir, of course, we come to the redoubtable, and I think she deserves a whole series of novels, Nur Jahan. Absolutely extraordinary character. You think a woman in a man's world, but you look at paintings of the period, and you normally don't find pictures of the very senior royal women, but you do find pictures of Nur, and what's she doing? She's holding a cup of wine in her hand, and she's looking out at you very confidently, almost challengingly. And we have accounts being sent back to the courts of Europe by visitors to the Mughal court, who say that they are in absolutely no doubt who is ruling in the Mughal Empire at this time, and it is not the emperor, it is Nur Jahan. Right. But after that period, when you reach the era of Mumtaz and some of the other Mughal princesses, they start to recede a little bit, if I could say, behind the veil. They become a little bit harder to discern, but you can find things like, for example, Mumtaz Mahal signing decrees on behalf of her husband. He gave her a special ivory seal to use, so she had a degree of authority. Jahanara very plainly had influence. If you look at life within the Mughal harems or zanana, whatever word you use, you find many women there conducting extremely successful businesses. These are women of wealth, prosperity, property. They own ships. We have an account of one English merchant who turned up in Hindustan hoping to make himself rich, writing back a very whingy, moaning letter back to England saying he wasn't able to get any cargoes of indigo. They just were not to be had because this matron in the Mughal court had a monopoly on the trade. So they have their economic as well as their political influence. And we've tried wherever we could to bring that out in the novels. And I know that when they make the TV series, there will be a lot of prominence given to the Mughal women.
That would be lovely. I remember one thing from your first book where Ihsan Begum advises Babur when he is being propped up on the throne to execute the rebels, and it's the woman who actually tells him, his grandmother, that you should set an example here. You cannot take any chances. I'm looking forward to the series as well, TV series, but since you mentioned Humayun and Jahangir, I'm curious to know how their depiction would be on TV. But don't you think that history has been a bit unfair to them because they are kind of sandwiched between two other great emperors, and that's why they have got far less attention from historians as well as novelists, perhaps?
Yes, it's always the difficulty, isn't it, of whichever walk of life you look at, that to be the child of a famous or successful parent. And, but I mean, I think we did find both of them intriguing in very different ways. I mean, Humayun, you were asking before which was our favorite emperor. I wouldn't call him my favorite emperor, but perhaps I found him the most interesting in some ways, because a young man who arrives with his father Babur at Panipat, this fighting warrior prince, but after Babur's death, starts to embrace this increasingly curious mystical life, I think largely induced by drink and drugs, a lot of wine, a lot of opium, and starting to become increasingly eccentric. And that's, again, you look to the women of the household trying to sort of hold things together. And eventually, actually not after so much time, falling into conflict with his own family, but also pushed out by a powerful ruler coming across from Bengal. So he loses everything that his father had gained in coming over the Indus, forced to throw himself on the mercy of the Shah of Iran, the Shah of Persia, according to some stories, having to trade the Koh-i-Noor diamond for Persian help to eventually get back on his throne. But I found the idea of this struggle, this very strong wife that he had, Hamida, helping him through all of this, the birth and kidnap of their son, Akbar, all of that absolutely fascinating. And then the sheer poignancy of Humayun eventually pulling himself together, getting back his throne, and then going up to the top of the Shir Mandal in Delhi one night to watch Venus rise in the night sky, hearing the call to prayer, hurrying down the steps, catching his slipper in the toe of his robe, crashing down the steps, hitting himself on the head. There's just a real poignancy in that story. And I find his personality interesting and at points really quite appealing, in spite of his obvious weaknesses.
Right, and he also assigned positions based on zodiac signs. You know,
Yes,
that's very interesting that you have brought
and
up
he
in the
used
book.
to only go in, I'm not good on which is left and which is right. He would only let people enter a room with either the right foot or the left foot. I'm not sure which was the one he used.
And you also mentioned Jahangir. I mean, you see this man coming, very ambitious, having, again, all the usual family difficulties that happen in Mughal families, but coming very much under the influence of Nur Mahal or Nur Jahan. But we have some very vivid images of him from accounts which were sent back by the first English ambassador to the court of the Mughal, Thomas Roe. And they plainly had these amazing sort of drinking parties together night after night. And we get a picture of gradually how Jahangir in his later years is declining and falling more and more under Nur's thrall. And it all seems so very relatable too, so very human. That's what I love about the Mughal story. There's so many universal themes running through that, although it's so many centuries ago, you could be looking at people around today, celebrity figures or whoever.
Right. Would you like to add to that? Something spectacular that you think defined Humayun or Jahangir?
No, I think one of the images is from Thomas Roe, the English ambassador to the court of Jahangir, who said Nur Jahan more or less came and threw water over them to sober them up in the morning, the pair of them.
Okay, so when we talk about the legacy of the Mughals, what was the first thing that attracted you to the Mughals? I mean, there must have been many things, but what was the first thing that you learned about the Mughals? Was it their food? Was it their architecture? Was it something else?
We're British, so you can imagine the answer to what it was. It was the food. I suppose it was visiting India and seeing those magnificent memorials and tombs and buildings, and that got us interested, I suspect.
Yes, because I mean, when you see architecture like that, those shapes, those forms, quite different to anything that we'd ever seen. And so, use that word perfect. What does perfect mean? We all have a different, it means something different emotionally to us. But I think we both had the same response to the Taj, that we were looking at something ethereal, literally, as all the cliches say, not of this world, a paradise-type building. So that was one of the first lures, I suppose, but then we went into other things like the literature of the court, the poetry, insofar as we could discern that. Of course, we had to read things in translation, but also the magnificence of some of the paintings. We talked about Jahangir just now. We didn't talk about him as a great patron of the arts, just as Akbar had been. These really beautiful miniatures which date from this period, and a lot of interaction between European courts and the Mughal courts, miniature paintings travelling backwards and forwards, people adopting each other's styles. And Jahangir's interest in nature, those wonderful miniature paintings of Nilgiri or of wildflowers. And you see a sort of a consummation, if you like, of the Mughals' early passion for nature. Even Babur, at the time when he was invading and busy cementing the heads of his enemies into towers, he could break off from all of that to gaze at the beauty of a tulip and weep over it. And you see all that brought to fruition later on in the Mughal court. And those aesthetic intellectual legacies, I think, really moved us.
And Jahangir apparently was so expert in identifying paintings that he could figure out the kind of brush that has been used on the canvas. Just by looking at the painting, at the finished product, he could figure out what sort of a brush has been used. So he had that sort of a finesse when it came to the arts. But I have to ask you this, and you being, I'm sorry I'm talking about this again and again, but you being outsiders to India, you have a definite view, your own view about India and the Mughals. Did you feel constrained in any way while writing your novels?
I think the first thing I'd say is there's many faces and many diversities to India itself. So it's always difficult to put a "the" before anything, because you've got so many different facets, so many different people. All people are individual. Having said all that, yes, we are outsiders, but where I come from in the north of England, if you moved in to a town that was more than 5 miles away from where you were an outsider for at least 20 or 25 years. As outsiders, I think people have been tolerant of our lack of knowledge, very helpful in informing us about what was happening, what they saw. The Archaeological Survey of India have really helped us to go round and see things. For example, they took us to the fortress of Burhanpur, which is where Mumtaz Mahal died when she was on campaign with Shah Jahan, and pointed out to us where was the actual room they thought she died in. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think basically we have been made far more welcome than we would have been in nearly anywhere else, and given a great deal of help.
Yes. Just to underline what Mike said about being made to feel very welcome in writing these books, which was so nice for us. So by contrast, the very first book we wrote a long time ago was about an aspect of Scottish history. There was a young prince from the Stuart royal house who led an invasion of Highlanders across the border into England. The idea was to take the throne from the Hanoverian King George. It's a well-known story. It's the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie, but full of drama and excitement, etc., and tragedy. And we were drawn to it for various reasons. And the book came out, and we got our first letter from a reader. And I opened it up. I was quite excited to see
This was the time you had letters, not emails.
Letters, yes. This is before. It shows how long ago there was no emails. And I was really pleased to get this. It was forwarded via the publisher. That's why I knew what it was. And I opened it up, and it was written in a spidery hand, and it was so viciously abusive that I've never forgotten it. And I really thought at that moment that this is perhaps the moment to stop. And I have to say with great gratitude that our books here have been greeted on the whole with great generosity and warmth by people, for which we are profoundly grateful.
Basically, this guy said, "You're not Scottish. What do you know about Scotland?"
Yes, I said, "You're English, and this is none of your business."
So have you had anyone tell you that you are not Mughal or you're not Indian? How dare you write about Indian characters?
I'm sure people will have said that, but I think we've always found people so very courteous and polite that nobody's actually said it to our faces. And maybe when we get to questions, the people here do feel that, but we've never overtly come across it. And I think in the writing, because we were talking about fiction, we were so drawn into the strength of the stories and the characters as revealed in the sources that we plunged into that, particularly starting our story in Central Asia, that we thought of the strength of the stories. We never really thought of ourselves as outsiders, except where we had difficulties in interpreting language and realizing that we had to rely on other people's translations.
The other thing to say about the books is they were commissioned by UK and US publishers. They weren't written with the Indian market forefront. They were written for the English reading world.
Wow. So you are more famous for your fiction work in India. And in India, there seems to be an idea among some people that if it is fiction, you can take as many liberties as you want. And you don't need to bother about the timelines, about the chronologies, the sequence of events. You can just insert as many things as you want. You could imagine as many things as you want. So as authors of fiction and great fiction, what do you have to say about that?
I think everybody has their different approach to things. I mean, we come from a background of writing as historians, so we're used to working with sources. And it seemed to us that if you were dealing with big, important figures and big important events, that you had a duty not to traduce the main elements of the story, if you like. So in our depiction of the Mughals, we tried to be true, we talked about chronology just now, we tried to be true to the sequence of events. So if we say that a battle happened on a certain date, we've tried to make sure that we got that right, or the order in which a campaign happened. But where we did feel free to take liberties, if that's the phrase, is to invent fictional characters, some occasionally fusions of real people who existed, to take 2 or 3 characters and meld them into one, because sometimes you need those secondary figures to move the drama on. You've got your narrative arc, you've got to keep the pace going, and you need sometimes invented figures to help with that. You need invented figures and some invented incidents to help where you have gaps in the sources. Sometimes the sources are silent on a period or leave what actually happened very vague. You feel free, I think, to interpret what you think might have happened. But what we've always tried to do, and we explain, each book has historical notes at the back, is where we have deviated from the main facts insofar as they're known, and where we have invented, and also where we've played around with timing. Although we've been true to the chronology, sometimes because of the need to maintain the narrative drive, we have shortened certain events. Something which might have taken 15 years or might be dull in the context of a novel, so you make it shorter. But we do try to be truthful at the back and to explain that, and also to give our sources so people who want to go a stage back and read those can actually backtrack the story.
And one of the things we have done, there's an awful lot of things that happen. You can't get into the space of 300 pages, so you have to be selective in what incidents you do cover.
So can we say that the historians in you put a tight leash on the imaginative authors?
I think given the sort of work that we've done for a number of years, we would have felt very uncomfortable writing a scene or attributing a motive or depicting a certain event in a way which we knew was contradicted by the source material that exists. And in a way, like Mike was saying, our problem was more what to leave out, because the stories are so dramatic in their own right, they're so rich that you don't need to try and invent too much.
But you do need to invent dialogue, you do need to invent detail of action, you do need to invent descriptions of colors, tastes, smells. You need to make it real, you need to make it human. So there's a lot of imagination and invention that goes into it, even if you accept the bare facts of X conquered Y fortress on this date. You want to know how he did it, what tactics he had. You want to know how he came home to his wife or partner after the battle. Well, you know, what did he do? Did he write about it, etc., etc.? You've got a lot of invention going into it.
Since you're talking about action, I'm going to pick that word up and talk about the battle scenes in your books. I mean, I thought those were very well laid out and lovely to read. So which one of you actually wrote those battle scenes?
I did.
You did? Okay.
Which is stereotypical because I'm the male. Yes.
No, we tried. I did some sort of minor skirmishes, but Mike is much, much better at it. And I've tried to write about battles. I don't have the ability to visualize what's going on at the various stages of a battle. You've got all this swirling smoke. You don't know what's going on here or there. A lot of it's just sort of noises and random things happening around you. Mike can see it all in his mind. I've tried to write complicated battles, but mine always finish in a couple of pages, and then they all sort of go and have a nice cuppa, and it's not got the right sort of dramatic feel at all.
So another thing that intrigues me, of course, when I read your books, I didn't know that you were two people. I thought it was always one person. How did you manage to keep the voice intact, since two different people are writing it? How did you do that? Set a story in one voice.
Basically by reading and editing each other's work, and occasionally having a little argument about some little bits of it.
And did you read each other's critical comments as well?
Yes, well, we have quite robust discussions about things. And I mean, we work in a sort of separate parts of our house. We each have our own study. And perhaps just to go a little bit further back, just say that when we were visualizing doing this series on the Mughals, what we began with was a framework to keep the arch of the story there. And so we ended up writing almost a sort of mini novel on each of them, and then having that, it sort of then started to treat it like a film script, breaking it down, not just the chapters, but scenes within chapters and scenes within scenes, and then deciding which of us was going to write which bit. And then, as Mike said, it became very iterative, each of us reading what the other had done. But there is one thing that Mike hasn't confessed to, which is that he will have nothing to do with typing anything or computers, so everything that Mike writes eventually gets dictated to me. He prowls backwards and forwards behind my chair, dictating, and I type what he writes. And that's also a moment where we can have a discussion about things.
And also, we do have editors as well. You have a main editor, and we have had actually editors in India, UK, and US looking at some of these books. So we've had 3 different lots of comments. After we've modified in the light of those 3 lots of comments, you then have the copy editor, who will also tell you a few things, check a few things you put in there. So there's a whole multitude, well, not multitude, there are at least 5 or 6 people who go into the production of the book.
Since I have to do justice to the theme, so we have talked about the rise of the Mughals, now we also have to talk about the fall of the Mughals. So you deal with that subject in your books. So what do you think about the conventional view that Akbar consolidated the empire, Aurangzeb frittered it away?
I think that Aurangzeb did indeed mark the end of the major period. He spent an awful lot of his money on campaign with his troops down in the Deccan without getting anywhere. He alienated his major allies, the Rajputs. He alienated a good proportion of his people. He even alienated a good proportion of his family. And you can't afford to expend too much money and lose a good deal of support. That is really a recipe for disintegration, because he was concentrating on the Deccan, and when he concentrated on the Deccan, his subordinates elsewhere saw a chance to cut out for themselves a bit more autonomy. And of course, there were the European powers at the time, the French, the English, looking on and thinking, this is a rich country. We want to trade with it, and therefore we would like some influence over certain of the political events. He allowed all that to happen. And then you know what happened. His sons, again, none of them ruled for very long, and the Mughal Empire slowly broke up.
Yes, I mean, it's almost a classic picture, isn't it, of the overextension of empire. If you look, you go from the small sort of sliver of land that Babur conquered after Panipat, and then you look at a map which shows how far Aurangzeb, at least theoretically, pushed the border, but how much of that did he actually control? And as Mike said, the administration was just falling apart. People were breaking away. The revenues were no longer coming in. You know, he's exhausted. You know, the Mughals had great wealth, but it was all being exhausted by these endless campaigns, which were basically a series of firefightings in the south. He was never able to consolidate anything for very long, constantly dealing with sort of cabals against him. It was all falling apart around him.
It's also very true that all empires overextend themselves when they begin to spend more money on defense than they do on anything else. Their economies begin to fail.
I think that's a good point to take the conversation to the audience now. I'm sure you have one question at the back, one question at the front. Do we have microphones? Okay. How Aurangzeb, he's asking, how did he manage to stay in power for 49 years? One reason is he didn't have to fight elections.
Yeah. That is true. But he started with a very strong position, and he had nobody else. He had kept his children subordinate. His brothers were gone, and so there was no real rival immediately. And I think people were genuinely very worried. He had such strong power at the time, which only slowly disintegrated.
Yes.
Have a different view?
Just to say that, yes, I mean, as Mike said, he inherited a position of great strength and great wealth. But whether it's true to say he was in power for 50 years, because he was losing control for quite a lot of the latter period, so that he was de facto the ruler of this great empire, how much of it was he any longer actually seriously controlling? There was anarchy breaking out.
I hope that answers your question.
Okay,
Yes,
my question is, Shah Jahan had cut off the fingers of all the craftsmen who had made that Taj Mahal. So there is truth in that.
I
isn't it?
think that story is completely, I don't know if Mike will agree with me, completely untrue.
Oh,
There's absolutely no historical basis for it at all. And even when we've been in Agra, we've met families who are very proud of the fact they have a tradition that members of their family actually helped work on the building of the Taj.
Okay.
And we have the accounts, not just the Mughal sources, but we have the accounts of a number of foreigners who were passing through at the time and watched the Taj being built and were there to see it come to fruition, who were there to attend the first time. There was actually a service held there for the Empress Mumtaz, the first death Urs. And there's not a whisper of anything from any reliable source that suggests that this was ever done. I think it's just a complete fiction.
okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, and we are looking forward to the serial that is going to be aired. I think it's going to be as
Not one
magnificent as The Crown. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. I've been told that we have really run out of time and we'll have to call it a day.
I'm sure that many of us has many questions, but we'll have to take it offline.
Okay,
and
we'll have to take it backstage
really
now.
sorry about it, but yes, we have to go ahead with the schedule.
But
Thank
lovely
you.
speaking to both of you, Diana and Michael, and you were a lovely audience. Thank you so
And
much.
we'd just like to say thank you so much to all of you. And thank you very much.